Hello and welcome to our weekly look at what's happening inside Syria. I'm Taimur Nabili. Well, the UN's General Secretary Ban Ki-moon has promised to try to speed up the deployment of some 300 monitors to Syria. So far, there are just 15 monitors in the country. That's a number that's expected to rise to around 100 within the next month. But as the violence in the country continues, many people are questioning whether these observers can make any difference. More than 2 weeks into the supposed ceasefire that was brokered by the UN Special Envoy Kofi Annan, more deaths are being reported daily. On Friday, 14 people were reported killed in Damascus, 10 civilians among them. Well, speaking in India's capital, New Delhi, Ban Ki-moon described the Syrian people's suffering as intolerable, and he urged an end to the violence.
Too many Syrian people have been killed, and Syrian people have been waiting too long. Syrian people have been suffering too much, too long. This has reached to an unacceptable, intolerable stage. Now, as Secretary General, and together with the Kofi Annans, our priority is to accelerate the deployment of supervision mission of 300 people.
Well, in the West, some officials continue to talk about possible other measures to be used against President Assad. On Friday, the U.S. Defense Deputy Undersecretary Kathleen Hicks said that Kofi Annan's diplomatic initiative is failing, and the U.S. has been working on a Plan B to put an end to the violence. Describing the possibility of a humanitarian corridor along the border between Syria and Turkey, she said, quote, "We are planning various strategies for a vast range of scenarios, including the possibility of helping allies and partners on the frontier zones." Well, France's Foreign Minister Alain Juppé has also talked about alternative plans. Juppé described Kofi Annan's scheduled report, due on May 5th, on the state of the ceasefire as a moment of truth. And he said if mediation isn't working,
Nous avons commencé déjà à évoquer avec nos partenaires.
We will have to move to another step that we have already started to talk about with our partners, under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, to move forward for the end of this tragedy which continues in Syria.
And on Friday, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov spoke out on the international community's attitude towards Syria and towards Russia and China. In comments to the Russia 24 TV channel, Lavrov said, quote, "The ceasefire announced on the basis of Kofi Annan's plan and supported by the UN Security Council is not being stable yet, mostly because the armed opposition groups are trying to stage provocations, explosions, terror attacks and shootings. All need to work honestly, and all who have influence on Syrian forces, both on the government and opposition, must use their influence for good purpose." Well, joining me now to discuss the latest situation in Syria, I have three guests. In London, Jonathan Paris is a Middle East analyst and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Jonathan's also a senior advisor with the Chertoff Group. In Riyadh, Farah Atassi is a Syrian political activist and president of the Syrian National Bloc, which is one of the opposition groupings. And in Massachusetts, Sami Hermez is a visiting professor at Mount Holyoke College in Northampton. He specializes in legal and political anthropology and is also teaching a class on Arab revolutions for the college. Thank you all very much indeed for being with us. Sami, let me begin with you then, if I might. Just give me your analysis right now of the latest state of play. I mean, we don't seem to be making any real forward movement, and yet we don't seem to actually have any particular plan either.
Yeah, I think the international community is at this point, and in the last few months, maybe most of this year, has been trying to posture itself. So Alain Juppé comes up with this, announcement of Chapter 7, but there's the French elections, and they're trying to sell Sarkozy's re-election. So there's a lot of political posturing going on. And I don't think that this is ultimately going to result in any sort of intervention, because the international community, on one hand, it is benefiting from the slow decline of Syria. So the U.S. and Europe are seeing the slow decline of Syria that, ultimately down the line they could probably, be able to force it into some kind of negotiations on Israel or any sort of a weaker Syria helps the Americans in their battle against Iran and so on. So I really don't see an actual urgency in intervening. At the same time, I think that all this discussion about international intervention is a real problem because it takes away from the agency of what's going on locally and people, and really trying to empower people locally into non-violent, peaceful forms of resistance.
Jonathan Paris,
that would be sort of my take.
Thanks, Sami. Let me come to Jonathan Paris. Let me just pick up on that idea of the slow decline, because in many ways, for this so-called international community, the anti-Syrian community, let's put it that way, the slow decline is actually a preferred scenario in many ways, isn't it?
I don't think so. I don't think a slow decline of Syria, the state of Syria, benefits anyone. It certainly doesn't benefit the Syrian people. We now have 10,000 over people dead.
Well, we'll talk about the Syrian people in just a minute. Sorry to interrupt you, but the point I'm making here, and I think the point that Sami was making, is the trajectory that we seem to be on right now leads to an eventual departure for Bashar al-Assad, leads to influence from the Western-backed communities for their influence in Syria, and prevents the necessity of the Western powers from actually taking any significant action and opening themselves up to criticism for more intervention in the Middle East. So in many ways, it's an ideal scenario.
Timur, you're right. I mean, it is a less risky scenario, and you're quite right to point out the reticence of the U.S. and others to intervene militarily. But I question whether time is on our side, in the sense that you see the radicalization of elements in the rebellion, more al-Qaeda types getting involved, more suicide bombers. And so I would prefer to see a more forceful trajectory. I think, though, that there is a logic to this escalatory ladder. It's not completely slow motion. If there is a chance to get Russia and China on board with another resolution that might provide, perhaps not Chapter 7, but might provide the humanitarian corridors that the United States call their Plan B, then maybe, and if Turkey were to agree to that, then maybe we could see a further delegitimization of the Assad regime, which would accelerate his end.
Farah Atassi, let me just question one phrase that Jonathan used there, and that was the reluctance to engage militarily. Now, that seems to be an accepted phraseology and an accepted position in most of the Western media, but is it actually an accurate reflection of policy? We heard only today, on Saturday, of an interception of arms headed for Syria, intended for the opposition forces. We've pretty much almost by default seen all the Western powers and some of the Gulf powers admitting that they are getting involved militarily already. They're supplying all sorts of support. Isn't it time to ditch this fallacy that there is no involvement?
First of all, the question about the military intervention, a direct military intervention, the big question: who will pay the price for this military intervention, and who will pay the bill? And if there is an international consistency or international concession and agreement on the importance of applying Chapter 7 and actually providing indirect military support either through the NATO or through Turkey. Now, back to your question about the ship and the smuggling of weapons to Syria, supposedly. There are still a lot of mystery and speculation and about this ship itself. We don't know where it is coming from. We don't know where is it going, and why we should take or believe the story of the regime that this shipment of weapons is actually going to the rebels. Why we don't say that it's going to support the Shabiha of Assad regime. There are no independent investigation specifically that we know.
Okay, so are you then
in Lebanon, in Lebanese government, they are supporting the regime and they will emphasize his story.
Are you then saying that all the comments that we've heard from the government of Qatar, from the government of Saudi Arabia, all the other stories in the media that have pointedly not been refuted by the governments of Britain about the involvement of its security forces in Syria, by the government of America about the involvement of the FBI. None of them have actually denied any of this. So are you suggesting that there is no actual interference in Syria by any outside governments?
Yeah, no, I'm just talking about the ship itself.
Well, I'm talking about the broader picture.
Seized by the Lebanese opportunity, but overall, absolutely, you know, that goes back to your point when you were talking about the humanitarian corridor and U.S. Plan B, and I think that's one way of solving, because the Syrian people need to defend themselves. There should be a clear and transparent mechanism and a plan and structure to support the Syrian resistance inside Syria by all help and the humanitarian corridor and the buffer zone. And Turkey is ready to impose, if it gets the green light from the Americans, to offer these humanitarian corridors, and that could be a pace to provide humanitarian, logistic and other military assistance to the Syrian opposition through clear passages.
Sami, you're shaking your head there. I mean, Farah was bringing up this idea of the Syrian opposition inside the country as if there is such a unified entity and such a body that actually exists in the way that she's presenting it. Just tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, there is no unified, Free Syrian Army, for example. So there's a lot of different groups out there that are armed, and I really think it's when a country is falling apart, as Syria is so unfortunate, there is this tendency to want to hang on to any outside power and any kind of, any sort of force to help you. And I think that's really misplaced, because the international community that uses the humanitarian card as a political tool. Let's face it. I mean, it's naive to think otherwise. And they're going to go in whenever they see their interests align perfectly. And so, as much as the Syrian people call for international intervention, it's not going to come unless the international community believes that it aligns with their interests. And so, you're really removing the power from the Syrian revolution, from the people on the ground who are trying to fight, and you're trying to align your interests and shape your interests in a way to match the international community. And it really shifts the debate away from what people are doing on the ground. And this constant in the media that we're talking about international intervention, instead of talking about what's going on, talking about how to empower the people on the ground. I think that's really the problem here. And I think the international intervention itself is going to produce far more casualties than already happening. And we don't even know what happened in Libya and the investigations that did not come forward on the kind of NATO destruction and the damage that was done there. And so it's not going to be pretty. It's not going to be.
All right, but surely
you think
surely
the
as
damage
much as
now it's going to be.
Sorry to interrupt, but surely as much as the question how to empower the people on the ground, there must also be the question of who to empower on the ground. Jonathan, this week we saw once another grouping announce itself, the son of a former Prime Minister of Syria, Mr. Naufal al-Dawalibi, someone I've never heard of before, announcing that he's setting up a government in exile. We have a number of other people purporting to represent the Syrian opposition, and yet very little evidence of any real support for either the Free Syrian Army as an entity, either for the Syrian National Council as an entity, any of these people who, if the West does get involved militarily, who are they going to back to take over?
Well, I agree with the growing frustration with the opposition, the disunified opposition. And I liked Mr. Hermez's point that by focusing on the international intervention that never happens, we shift the focus away from the brave people who are fighting. I don't see, though, that that's an either or. I don't see why smart people in New York and where the UN is and elsewhere can't figure out a way to help these brave people who are trying to overthrow a tyranny. I don't see why it is either or. I don't see why we can't get up the escalatory ladder toward more force and to further delegitimize the Assad regime internationally, as well as help the brave people, whether through munitions or other support. It shouldn't be either or. They should be working together. One way or another, Bashar al-Assad has lost his legitimacy. He will have to leave power. The question is, who will come in place of him? But right now, I think we need to better align the international intervention types and the help needed on the ground.
Just for the purpose of this conversation, we'll allow the point that one way or another Bashar al-Assad has lost his legitimacy. I think many people might even argue with that, but let's allow that as a basic starting point. However, the brave people trying to overthrow a tyranny, as you phrased it, is the question that I'm trying to get to, because those brave people don't seem to have any unified perspective here, and many of them don't want to overthrow a tyranny. They just want their own grievances heard. Let me bring it to Farah. I mean, you represent a group, a bloc of these opposition people. How do you see, once Assad has gone, let's assume that happens, how do you see your group interacting with the other groups who are desperately vying for interest in this situation?
You know, we are all the Syrian national power who are supporting regime change. All of them are working together, actually. I disagree with some of your points. There are a lot of a lot of exaggeration when we're talking about the opposition group are not unified as they should on the means and ends on how to really overthrow the Syrian regime. Yet all of them has some sorts of agreement on the future of Syria, of what's next to Syria, where all of us, we are fighting for the Syria, the land of the constitution and the law, Syria, where we can all experience our citizenship that we never experienced or practiced our real citizenship under the tyranny, under one-party regime and one family ruling Syria over 40 years. We want to end this control of the Syrian, one Syrian family and one Syrian Ba'ath party of that regime, and eventually the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, lost its legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. And going back to the military intervention, gentlemen, we should not forget that there is an actual international intervention inside Syria now. The Russian intervention, the Iranian intervention, the Iranians did not hide their logistic, military and intelligence support to the Syrian regime. Who will help the Syrian people? I agree with you when we are talking about how to empower the Syrian people inside Syria, how to empower the Syrian resistance when they are somehow isolated and somehow they are surrounded by tanks and by military and excessive violence from the regime who is bombing civilian neighborhoods. Only in Hamas, 70 people dead in one day. If there is no humanitarian corridors, if there is no organization and a structure on helping and having a command on the ground that they really can control the situation and they can breathe, take a breath.
Let me bring it to Sami.
On the ground, please, let me raise one important point.
I'm sorry, we have to allow the others to get a word in as well. Sami, let me bring it to you. The situation that
just the power.
Go ahead.
Just wanted to respond. The power of the Syrian people is moral power, not armed power. And the more arms that are coming in from Qatar and Saudi Arabia and whoever wherever. I mean, there are Syrians on the ground who are expressing frustration at the way this revolution has become, the opposition has become armed and armed in a way that's not really focused. And they've had meetings last week or 2 weeks ago in Cairo. There are people who are struggling non-violently, but we don't give them any space in the media. We don't give them any space, to express their positions. And I think that's a problem, because the real power is that non-violent, peaceful mobilization, and and trying to and not arming it in this kind of way. I think. Well,
let me put it to Jonathan. Jonathan, why has the UN and the backers of intervention not actually considered the idea that not arming the opposition may have been the way forward, that trying to implement the other part of Kofi Annans' plan, and let's not forget that Kofi Annans' plan included the suggestion that the Syrian opposition should be laying down their arms, which they haven't done. Why is that option not being more vigorously pursued?
Well, if you've watched what's happened in Hermez in the last 2 months, and before that in 6 or 7 other places, you see one side with modern weapons attacking a defenseless other side.
Well, let me stop you. Let me stop you there. My whole point here being they're not defenseless. We know, we've already agreed on this program that they're being armed, and it's interesting how the Arab League monitors who went in there, their report when they came out was almost completely ignored, and that contained many strong phrases suggesting that a lot of the violence was actually being carried out, as Bashar al-Assad's government has said, by these opposition forces. They're not entirely helpless.
You have to look at the trajectory. This started out, as Mr. Hermez says, as a moral uprising, a la Tahrir Square, only much more decentralized, but no weapons, peaceful demonstration. Then you would see, you know, snipers from the Syrian military and the Shabiba, attacking these defenseless people. So it was only a natural revolution that those people who were being attacked would arm themselves. I don't begrudge them the right to self-defense. And if the Syrian army had not attacked the unarmed people, it would have continued to be a moral, nonviolent uprising.
Well, look,
but you have to look at what's happened between, say, May of last year and today, and what we've seen is ruthlessness by the Syrian army, as the other speaker said, aided by the Iranians and others. Well, and it's just totally one-sided. So of course you're going to have the other side.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right in quoting a narrative that, as we've heard in all the media consistently, but it's just the Western narrative. Surely, let me just read to you from the report of the Arab League monitors that went in there, just a couple of phrases because it was a relatively long thing. And they say, in Homs, Idlib, Hama, the government forces and civilians were, the observer mission witnessed acts of violence being committed against government forces and civilians that resulted in several deaths and injuries. They give numerous examples, and they say that the political process of dialogue within the country is the way that this should go forward. And there's plenty more of this stuff in that Arab League report, none of which was necessarily given much airtime. Sami, let me put this to you. Was the idea, this narrative that it's all Assad's forces that are responsible, one that really holds water?
I mean, you know, the Assad forces are ultimately responsible, but when the opposition is relying on repressive regimes like Saudi Arabia, what kind of strength does that give the opposition? You know, it becomes really difficult to, at this point, argue for the opposition side when they're relying on, you know, weapons coming from these places that are themselves repressive. So ultimately, of course, it's the Assad regime's fault for dragging the country into this direction. But you know, now that we're here, you know, we have to deal with the situation. And I think, you know, your guest was saying that it's not either or, the UN, the United Nations, or the people on the ground. But the problem is that humanitarian intervention is politicized. It's been politicized since the foundation of the United Nations. And so we have, you know, we can't forget that. And so, you know, that's fundamental.
Well, the politics is the latest the word. I mean, we started the show off with Ban Ki-moon and the UN observer mission. Farah, let me ask you, do you think this observer mission is politicized, or do you think it will actually be of any use?
First of all, allow me to make a real clarification.
We only have 1 minute left, so if you be succinct, that would be great.
Yes, really, very shortly. I'll try to be very brief. It is so unfair and unjustified to compromise or make an equal compromise between the state armed forces and between a small Syrian rebels group who are trying to defend themselves. Till now, the Syrian revolution, it started peaceful, and till now, it is a peaceful revolution. Just last Friday, thousands and thousands of people went out to the streets calling for Assad regime to leave. The Syrian resistance who are defending themselves in those neighborhoods, they are becoming the symbol of revolution. They have the right to defend the revolution and defend themselves. Those people are actually providing protection to those peaceful even demonstration in places like Hama, like Homs, like in Idlib and other places. And it is so unfair to make a compromise between between, or to make a comparison between a state army with tanks and bombs and intelligence support and aid from the Iranian and a small group of people. I don't accept someone to come and tell me
that is where we're going to have to leave it, Farah. Thank you very much indeed. You've made your point, but we've run out of time completely. That is it for today's show. Just a quick thank you again to my guests from London, Jonathan Paris, from Riyadh, Farah Atassi, and from Massachusetts, Sami Hermez. And thank you very much indeed for watching the show. If you want to catch it again online, just go to our website, aljazeera.com. That's it from me and the team here in Doha. Goodbye for now.